In this section, I wanted to touch on the gains that can be made from trade. This is generally more applicable in macroeconomics and international trade, but it is part of basic economic theory, so I will introduce it now. Specialization is this idea that when we start producing either one or only a few goods, taken in the context of a country, it is possible for a nation to specialize in the production of, let's say, only one good. If this happens, that country will gain insight into more efficient ways of producing that one good, as all its resources are diverted to producing only that one good. This often results in a greater level of efficiency in production and thus lower prices for consumers. Comparative advantage is defined as the ability of one producer to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Oftentimes, this is associated with efficiency. If one producer has a comparative advantage compared to another, they can be said to be more efficient at producing the good. Absolute advantage, on the other hand, deals with overall productivity. If producer A can produce more of a good regardless of their efficiency than producer B, then producer A is said to have the absolute advantage in the production of a good. The concepts that I have just mentioned are a little complicated to understand, so here is an example that will hopefully clear things up. Imagine an economy with two producers. Producer A is Joe, who runs a clothing factory. He only has one sewing machine in this factory, so he isn't technologically advanced as he otherwise could be. Joe can produce in a given hour either 6 pairs of socks or 30 t-shirts. He can't produce 6 pairs of socks and 30 t-shirts. He can only produce 6 pairs of socks or 30 t-shirts. We will say that he can also produce some combination of t-shirts and socks that satisfy his time constraint. If we do the math, we can say that it takes him 2 minutes to produce a t-shirt and 10 minutes to produce a pair of socks. If we want to know the opportunity cost of producing a pair of socks, we need to think of the best alternative Joe has with the 10 minutes it takes him to make those socks. In 10 minutes, Joe can also produce 5 t-shirts. Thus, the opportunity cost of producing a pair of socks is 5 t-shirts. Similarly, in the 2 minutes it takes Joe to produce a t-shirt, he could have produced a fifth of a pair of socks. I get it, it's not a complete pair, it's more like a little bit of a sock that he has worked on. Thus, the opportunity cost of making a t-shirt is making a fifth of a pair of socks. Our second producer, Liz, also runs a clothing factory. She also only produces socks and t-shirts. The only difference is that in a given hour, Liz can produce either 30 pairs of socks or 30 t-shirts. Thus, she takes 2 minutes to produce a t-shirt and 2 minutes to produce a pair of socks. Thus, she could either use 2 minutes to produce one t-shirt or one pair of socks. Thus, her opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is a pair of socks, and her opportunity cost of producing a pair of socks is one t-shirt. On the graphs below, we can see Joe and Liz's production possibility frontiers. Essentially, Joe can produce at any point on or inside his production possibilities frontier, and Liz can produce at any point on or inside her production possibilities frontier as well. Neither of them can produce outside of their respective production possibility frontiers. So we've established that both Liz and Joe have different opportunity cost of producing socks and t-shirts, and both can produce different amounts in total. If we look at socks alone, Joe has to sacrifice making 5 t-shirts for every pair of socks he makes, while Liz only has to give up 1 t-shirt for every pair of socks she makes. Thus, since her opportunity cost of producing socks is lower, we can say that Liz has the comparative advantage in producing socks. On the other hand, it costs Joe a fifth of a pair of socks to produce 1 t-shirt, while it costs Liz a full pair of socks to produce a single t-shirt. Thus, since Joe's opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is lower than Liz's opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt, we can say that Joe has the comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. As for absolute advantage, both can produce the same amount of t-shirts if they focus all their efforts on t-shirt production, but Liz can produce more pairs of socks if she specializes in socks. Thus, nobody has the absolute advantage in terms of t-shirt production, but Liz has the absolute advantage in terms of sock production. The information we extracted from the problem can now be applied to our economy in order to make it even more efficient. We get Joe and Liz to specialize in producing whatever they are more efficient at. Joe has the comparative advantage in producing t-shirts, while Liz has the comparative advantage in producing socks. Thus, Joe will only produce t-shirts and Liz will only produce socks. They then trade with each other. Let's pick some random price that they will trade at, say 2 t-shirts per pair of socks. On the other hand, this would also mean that 1 t-shirt would trade for half a pair of socks. For Joe, this is a good deal, because if he were to produce socks by himself, it would cost him 5 t-shirts to produce. Now he only has to pay Liz 2 t-shirts per pair of socks. This is also a good idea for Liz, because if she were to produce t-shirts by herself, it would cost her a full pair of socks per t-shirt she made. If she trades with Joe, she only needs to pay him half a pair of socks to buy a t-shirt. Both Liz and Joe can buy the good for which they do not have a comparative advantage in producing from the other person. As a general rule of thumb, if the trading price of the goods are less than the opportunity cost of production, then both producers will gain from trade. Liz gains from trade because she can buy t-shirts from Joe at a lower cost than her own opportunity cost of production. And Joe gains from trade because he can buy socks from Liz at a lower cost than his own opportunity cost of production. In essence, if they trade, they can consume outside of their production possibilities frontiers. Do keep in mind, though, that they do not, by any means, produce outside of their production possibilities frontiers.